You have been selected to serve on a case that is central to the enforcement of agreements in our system. Before you is the case of James versus Mike, where the plaintiff, James, alleges that the defendant, Mike, has breached a contract that was duly executed between the two parties. A breach of contract occurs when one party fails to fulfill their obligations under the terms of the agreement without lawful excuse. The plaintiff claims that the defendant has failed to deliver services that were specified in the contract, resulting in financial losses and damages. The plaintiff and defendant entered into a contract on January 5, 2024, where the defendant agreed to provide consulting services to the plaintiff for a period of 6 months. The plaintiff alleges that the defendant ceased to provide these services after 2 months, without justification, and has since been unresponsive to attempts to resolve the matter. Your duty is to determine whether the defendant has indeed breached the agreement as alleged by the plaintiff. You must consider the evidence presented, the testimony of witnesses, and the arguments made by the attorneys in this case. To find a breach of contract, you must determine that a valid contract existed between the parties, that the plaintiff performed their obligations or was excused from performing, that the defendant failed to perform their obligations under the contract, and that the defendant's failure to perform caused damages to the plaintiff. You will hear testimony from representatives who will provide details of the contract and the services that were to be rendered. You will also hear from the defendant, who may present evidence of their performance or reasons for non-performance. Financial experts may testify regarding the damages incurred by the plaintiff due to the alleged breach. They will provide analysis on the expected benefits from the contract and the losses suffered as a result of the defendant's actions. As jurors, you are the sole judges of the credibility of the witnesses. Consider the consistency of their testimony, their demeanor, any biases or interests in the outcome, and the reasonableness of their statements in light of all the evidence. The intent of the parties at the time of the contract's execution is relevant to your deliberations. Consider whether the defendant intended to fulfill their obligations and whether any non-performance was justified. The defense may argue that the contract was not breached, that the defendant performed all required obligations, or that any failure to perform was due to circumstances beyond their capabilities. The plaintiff contends that they have upheld their end of the contract, and that the defendant's failure to perform has caused them significant financial harm. In your deliberations, you must consider the totality of the evidence presented. If you find that the plaintiff has proven each element of breach of contract by a preponderance of the evidence, then you must find for the plaintiff. If, however, you find that the plaintiff has not met their burden of proof, you must find for the defendant. If you find for the plaintiff, you must then determine the amount of damages. The plaintiff is entitled to be placed in the position they would have been in had the contract been performed. This may include direct losses and any other damages that were foreseeable at the time the contract was made. Your verdict must be unanimous. You will be provided with a verdict form where you will indicate your decision. It is your duty to apply the law as instructed to the facts as you have found them to be. This case highlights the importance of contractual agreements and the expectations that they be honored. Your verdict will speak to the value our society places on the integrity of contractual agreements. As you deliberate, you must consider the evidence in light of the contract law principles. A contract is a legally binding agreement that creates mutual obligations enforceable by law. The elements of a contract include an offer, acceptance, consideration, mutual assent, and a legal purpose. When interpreting the contract, you should give the words use their common and ordinary meaning, unless it is clear that the parties intended a different meaning. You may also consider the context of the contract, including the business environment and the relationship between the parties. A breach is not merely a technical or inconsequential failure to comply with the terms of the contract. To constitute a breach, the failure must be material and must result in a loss or detriment to the other party. You must decide if the defendant's actions or inactions significantly impaired the value of the contract to the plaintiff. The law requires that the plaintiff take reasonable steps to mitigate or decrease the damages resulting from the breach. If you find that the plaintiff failed to mitigate damages, this may reduce the amount of compensation they are entitled to recover. In your discussions, you should not be swayed by sympathy, prejudice, or public opinion. Your verdict must be based solely on the evidence presented, and the law, as I've instructed you on here today,